Okay, so I just switched over. Here's exercise 105, right? It's the same handout that you got in paper form, but I actually want you to download something. So as we scroll down here under this part 1, you're going to download the sample file. This is a Photoshop blending modes.psd file. That's a Photoshop file, right? That's already set up for you. Right-click on it, say Save Link As, put it on your flash drive somewhere, and you want it to be in Adobe Photoshop format. So we could actually add .psd behind it just to make sure. Can't type this morning. PSD. And you'll save it somewhere. I'll save it on the desktop for right now. Ideally, it would go on your flash drive. Okay? After it's downloaded, you're going to go ahead and open it up in Photoshop. You can do that by double-clicking on it, or you can open Photoshop first and say File, Open, to open that file. Okay? And what your end result is going to be a file that looks like this. Okay? So I'm going to wait until everybody has this file up so we can do the remaining steps together. All right, so we're looking pretty good. And now we're going to start to play around with what's happening. Okay? So I have my Photoshop file here. Oops. Go back to the rectangular marquee. I have several layers. The bottommost layer, remember the way the layers work, the one that's on the bottom is as if we had a stack of papers. It's the one on the bottom. Okay? As we go up, these are layers on top of layers, etc. We're going to ignore layer 2 and layer 3. Those are going to show you a couple different things down the road. We're going to start with just layer 1. Okay? Over here in the layers palette, I'm going to click on layer 1 to make sure it's highlighted in that light blue color. Once it's highlighted, I'll come up to the top of the layer palette here, and I'm going to adjust. Right now it says normal. There's a little drop-down menu. Those are my blending modes. We see this list looks exactly the same as the list that I was showing you in lecture format. Okay? And we're going to start with the multiply blending mode. And remember, multiply should darken your particular image. So when we choose multiply, right, you can see that the white area goes completely transparent. The middle area is slightly darker, and the dark area becomes very dark. Okay? If we switch from multiply down to screen, which is going to lighten the image, we'll switch, and now we have the dark doesn't do much. The medium lightens the blue a little bit, and the white becomes almost entirely white. Okay, so it's the exact opposite. So once again, our multiply was darkening. Our screen was lightening. Okay. And our last option here was overlay. And in the overlay mode, we both darken and lighten and don't affect the middle. Okay, the middle stays neutral. So again, it's a little bit hard to get used to, but as we go into photos and you start to see it, it'll make a little bit more sense. I do, however, like to show you how this has an architectural implication. Okay? And so some of you may have been in a studio class before, like 121. Some of you may be in 121 right now. And one of the things that will be asked of you is to make a poster of something. Right? Chances are you're going to do some little bit of modeling in SketchUp. Maybe you do that folding cube project or something like that, and you get this nice output, and SketchUp produces an output for you that is a colored image on a white background. Okay? And if you need that to be cut out so that you can see through the background and it's not white, typically you'd come into Photoshop and you'd erase the background and that sort of thing. Okay? But that's really annoying to have to do. So instead, I'm going to turn off layer 1, I'm going to turn on layer 2, and we see that this is an output from SketchUp. Okay? It's a line drawing from SketchUp, no colors. It has a strong white background on it right now. But instead of going through and, let's say, I could do it really quickly here. Oh, let me take the polygonal lasso and let me come along these lines, and I'm going to cut this piece out, and we'll go up here and we'll cut this piece out, and then let's get rid of that piece. We'll delete that. OK, I can kind of see through it. OK, it's too much work. Instead, we're just going to take this image right here. We're going to change the blending mode to multiply. And suddenly the white becomes transparent. And the dark lines show through onto whatever our backdrop would be. Okay? The opposite would probably not be desirable. If we went to screen mode instead, right, we would keep the white, but we'd let the blue color shine through instead of black. And our overlay mode isn't going to do much of either. It's kind of a weird hybrid. So in this case, we wouldn't use that. So we would almost always use multiply to let our lines be, the black lines shine through. I have another option, though, for you, and that is the inverted SketchUp drawing, where we have the white lines. And in this case, if we switch to multiply, it would let the blue line show through, but we'd keep the black, which isn't what we were after. But we could switch to screen mode, which would give us the kind of old school blueprint look. Okay, so we can take the black lines, or excuse me, the white lines, and let them shine through on a kind of a bluish colored background. Okay, the middle ground here, the overlay mode, again doesn't do too much. It's kind of a hybrid of the two, but it doesn't help. Okay, so I like to include these as part of the sample file because I want you to see the architectural implication of what blending modes can do before we really get there. Right? This will happen toward the very end of the semester, but I like to at least introduce why blending modes are important long term. So what we're going to do today, however, is to deal with what do these blending modes do in regards to photography. Because we're talking about digital photos, we're talking about quality post-processing of our images, and in doing that, we want to talk about what can a blending mode do for our images themselves. And if you are interested in blending modes, you can do a Google search for blending mode tutorials and photos, and you can see a bunch of different strategies for things that you do. I'm going to cover kind of the basics today. There are, of course, more advanced things that you can do that can really enhance your photos further, but I only have so much time in the class to teach you so many things. So I picked what I think are the most important, and that's what we're going to go with. So I'm going to start by finding an old black and white image, and I'll do that on the Creative Commons search. Search.creativecommons.org. You could use a Google image search. The advantage of a Creative Commons search is these are images that people have authorized you to work with. And so you don't really run into any major copyright issues by using these images. So I might look for old black and white photograph. Sometimes just old photograph works. And we can kind of scroll through. We want something that's really kind of faded. So maybe instead we'll do faded photograph. Nope, that doesn't like me. Back to Creative Commons here. Right? So an image like this might be something that we'd be after. Right? Kind of an old scan of an image, something like that. When I find the image, I'm going to go ahead and download the image. There's a little icon with an arrow and a line underneath it. In the world of Flickr, that means download. And we'll download the largest size available. In this case, it's the original size. I'm going to show it in my folder. I'll then copy it to my flash drive. And today is 105. And let me create a new folder. For fall of 2016. And we'll go ahead and paste that right there. Okay? So after I have that, I'll come into Photoshop and I'll go to File and then Open. And I'll go to my fall 2016 folder, and there's the photo that I just downloaded. Okay? So when we have an old kind of scanned photo like this, typically there are parts of the image that really need some work. Right, or some enhancements. They're not really exposed correctly, and we'd like to fix that. This is probably the easiest way to see how a blending mode really works in a photograph form, but I'll show you some examples of working with newer photos as well and what happens there. So here it is. In order to apply a blending mode, I have to have two layers. So if we look over here on the layers palette, we only currently have one layer, and that's the background layer. It's italicized and has a lock icon on it, which means that it's a locked layer. There's nothing that I can actually do to change it. If we tried to change the blending mode, it wouldn't even let me do it. Okay? So first thing that I need is a copy of this background layer so that I have two layers. So I can right-click on background, and I could say duplicate layer, and say OK. And now I have background copy and background itself. Okay? In the world of Photoshop, it's always good habit to get into to rename your layers. So instead of background copy, I'm going to rename this to be blending mode. Right, just so we can be clear. Okay? Blending mode allows me to change the blending mode on this particular context. So I'll right-click, or I'll click on here, and I'm going to choose the first one, which is multiply. Okay, when I do that, we can see almost an instant transformation of the old faded photograph, right, to being one that has a lot more depth. It's hard for you guys to see it on the projector screen, but I'm sure when you're working on it in your own image, you can see that there's a lot more detail in parts of the image that before were very, very washed out. Right? So just simply doing that starts to enhance the photo. Okay? And I'm going to go ahead and rename this. We'll call this BM for blending mode, and I'm going to call this multiply. Just so that we can be clear, I'm going to create new layers each time. Okay? So this is blending mode multiply. You can adjust the intensity of the blending mode application by adjusting the opacity slider, which is right here next to multiply, down. So right now it's at 100%. There may be somewhere between 0 and 100% may be the sweet spot of the right amount of darkening of the image. You'll have to see to your eye what feels right when you're working on your particular image. Okay? The other thing that can happen is sometimes you might want more than 100% darkening. You need a little bit more. If we duplicate the blending mode multiply layer, right, it doubles the darkening that's happening, and then we could adjust the topmost opacity down. So if I went to 50% right here, that would be 150% because I have one full layer at 100% plus another layer at 50% of darkening. So I've gone beyond the first blending mode. So anyway, I just like to show you that because it's rarely necessary, but at least you realize that you can stack those layers together. Okay? So I have my blending mode multiply. Let's go ahead and just get rid of this layer so it's not confusing. I have my blending mode multiply. We can see what it does right there. The next thing that I'm going to do is create another copy of this layer. And so as I did before, I'm going to right-click on the layer and say duplicate layer. By the way, you can also take the layer itself and drag it down to the new layer icon, which will create a copy of it as well. Okay, it depends on which way works better for you. And I'm going to rename this one to BM screen. So that's blending mode screen. I'll put it on top. And I'm going to turn off the multiply layer altogether. And then on the screen layer, I'm going to change, instead of doing multiply, I'm going to do screen. Okay? And so screen, in this particular case, doesn't do too much to enhance the image. It's making the image lighter because screen is lightening the image. It may give me a little bit more detail if I were to zoom in around her scarf, for example, that I wouldn't otherwise see, maybe. Okay? But this one's not that common, doesn't help that much for this particular image. Okay? So I now have a screen and a multiply. And let's try the last option, which was an overlay. So once again, I'll duplicate the background layer. So right-click, duplicate layer. There it is. I'm going to rename this one to BM overlay. And now I'll take this BM overlay and I'll change it to B overlay, which should darken the darks and should lighten the lights, which is kind of the best of both worlds. Okay? So again, we might have to adjust the intensity with which this is applied using the opacity slider. Right? But we can now cycle through and say, that's just screen, that's just multiply, and that's a combination of the two, which probably is the best result. Okay? So I've worked to try to improve this original image. Okay? Now this still has kind of its brownish tones to it, right? Remember, everything in this class builds on itself. So if I wanted this to be true black and white, I could also add the adjustment layer to convert it to black and white. And I'm doing this as partly as review. I'm not asking you to do it on the sheet here. But I could go to layer. I could say new adjustment layer. Oops, layer, new adjustment layer. And we're going to do a channel mixer. I'm going to name it black and white. Say OK. Turn it to monochrome. And again, I could adjust the preset depending on which one felt right as I go through these. Right? That one might be nice. Right? And that's just converting it from the brown tones to the black and white tones. Okay? Again, not something that's required, but I like to reinforce the things that we've already learned and talked about. Okay? So what you're going to be doing is you're going to pick your image. This is in part 2. Okay? You're going to pick an image, and then you're going to apply a multiply on it. Okay? So we'll start with just the basic background image. Here it is. I'm going to go File, Save for Web. By the way, I had an email over the weekend about working on their assignment, and they couldn't find Save for Web. Okay? In Adobe Creative Cloud, the newest version that you guys can download and subscribe to on your home computers, Adobe got rid of the whole Save for Web thing. So in your case, you just do a Save As and skip the Save for Web. Okay? It technically is still there. It's under like Legacy or something, and you can do it. But the point is they got rid of it. So just do a Save As instead if you're not on the school computers. But for us here on the school computers, we're going to do a Save for Web. So I'll do File, Save for Web. I'm going to save this one, again, into my folder here. And we'll call this old photo 1 underscore original. And I'll go ahead and save. I could change the image size. There's an ability to change the image size right here. This image is small enough to where it doesn't really need to be changed. Okay? Then I'll turn on the multiply right here, and I'll go to File, Save for Web. I'll click Save. And this one I'm going to change to be multiply. And then I'll go ahead and save. So under part 2, I have the original and I have the multiply. Okay? When we move on to part 3 with screen, you could do the same image and apply the screen, or you could do a different image. And for the sake of practice, I'm going to do a couple more here just so you can see it. I have, say, this one. Well, let's do this one here. Okay? Another old image. I'll go and create a duplicate of the background layer. Again, I can drag it to the new layer, or I could right-click and say Duplicate Layer. I'll take the background copy here, and I'm going to change to screen mode. There it is. And I get the new version, which is lightened. Okay? It gives me a little bit more detail here in the shadows. And then we'll go ahead and we'll do File, Save for Web. I'll click Save. This is old photo 2 screen. And I'll click Save. And then I should turn off this and do File, Save for Web. And this would be the original. And then I'll go ahead and click Save. Okay? So the point is I'm going to go through. I'll do the same thing for multiply. So I could take this one and, oops, turn it on here. Right, we'll come down, to overlay, and we get the combination of the two, and I could save that one as overlay. Okay? So for parts 2, 3, and 4, okay, you could have a total of 6 images, or you could have a total of 4 images. If you use the same image for each one, you'd have 4. If you use different images for each one, it would be 6. Okay? It doesn't really matter. I'm not going to go through and count your images. The point is I want at least one of multiply, one of screen, and one of overlay. Okay? when we move on to part 5, right, this is going to, instead of working with an old black and white photo or something, we're going to pick an image that has a lot of reds or blues in it. So this is ideal for, say, a sunset or something along those lines. So if we did, again, you could use one of your own images, or we could search for an image of a sunset or something like that. So I could say sunset. And I could pick some image that has blues and reds, etc. in it. And we could then download that image. Go ahead and download the original size here. I'm going to show it so that I can copy it and put it into my flash drive. And it clearly doesn't like me right now. There we go. Let's paste that in there. And then I'll go ahead and open that up in the world of Photoshop here. I'll go to File and then Open. And I'll open up that sunset. Again, something dominated by the reds and the blues. Okay? So next thing that I'll do is I'm going to make a curves adjustment layer, right, based on the Photoshop 1.3 tutorial that we already did. So just for review, I'm going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. And I'll say OK. And I'm going to peg the center. And then I'll adjust this a little bit and adjust this a little bit. So this is what I mean by that traditional S curve, where we do just a little bit of an S as part of the curve. And we can see what it was before to what it is after, a little bit more saturation. Okay? But next thing that I'll do is I'll take the curves layer, and on the curves layer, I'll apply something called luminosity, which is right down here. Okay? It's at the very bottom. And that luminosity tweaks the curves so that it's not quite as oversaturated, right? But we end up really enhancing and punching out the colors without making it too muddled in terms of the reds and the blues. And it's one of those things that's probably hard for you to see on the screen, but you'll be able to see the difference when you do it on your own. Okay? So the reason that I'm having you do this luminosity one is because I want you to understand that a blending mode doesn't have to apply to a duplicate of the photo. It could apply to an adjustment layer. So we do the curves adjustment layer, and then we apply the luminosity to that. Okay? So then we move to part 6. So again, I would save the original and the adjustment layer for part 5. Part 6, we're going to add some kind of a texture behind our image. Okay? And it doesn't really matter what image we start with. I could use the sunset. I could pick a brand new image. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply something behind it. Okay? And I have a bunch of grunge textures that I've saved over time. But if you do a Google search for grunge texture, right, you can start to see a bunch of grunge textures. We could also do a Creative Commons search so that we'd have license to use it for grunge texture. And what grunge textures essentially are is dirt, or something that's dirty, or paper, or crinkled, or something that's not sharp. And we're going to use that to enhance our image. So maybe something like this. Yeah?
Question. Is there a way to just get the picture from there without all the files and stuff?
I don't fully understand the question.
Each time I try saving a picture from like Flickr, it saves as a file with a bunch of other stuff.
Okay. Well, when I find the file, did you click on this little arrow at the bottom?
No.
Okay. So when you find the file and you look at it this way, in the lower right corner there's an arrow with a line under it. Mm-hmm. If you click on that, you can then choose just the original size of the image. And once you get that, you should get just one image.
All right, yeah.
Okay? And now that I have that one image, if it finishes downloading here, there we go. I'm going to go ahead and copy that and put it on my flash drive. And I know it's a bit of a pain to keep copying it on your flash drive. The truth is that you're going to want to start collecting these sorts of things because they end up being valuable. I'll go to Paste, For those of you that took the 136 class, you know when I was doing the floor plans and the shadows and that sort of thing, or the section cuts, I used these grunge textures as part of the backgrounds in those. So it's the same strategy here. OK, so there's that grunge texture. I'm going to go back to Photoshop, and I'm going to apply it to this sunset, for lack of something better to see it. OK, so I'll take that. I'm going to go up to File, and then Place. And again, this is written out under Part 6. And I'm going to choose that grunge texture, right, this one here, and I'll click Place. Okay, sometimes it comes in rather small. I need it to be big enough to cover my image. So I'm going to go to one of the corners. You see that I get kind of a double-sided arrow. As I start to move it, you can see that I can distort the image. If I hold down Shift on the keyboard, it will stay in proportions as I make it a little bit bigger. So it's staying in proportions. I want to make sure it's bigger than my image itself. So something along those lines. Okay? And I'll finish by clicking this little check mark in the upper kind of toolbar ribbon. And when I click that little check mark, my image, my grunge texture appears. Now, obviously, this isn't my image. It doesn't look particularly good. Okay? But this is where the blending mode starts to come into effect. So I'm going to take my placed image, which shows up right here, and I'm going to switch the blending mode into one of the presets that we've been working with. So we'll try multiply first. And when I do multiply, we can see that the texture applies to my photo itself. So this kind of background texture, whatever it is, this is almost, the one that I picked is almost like a canvas or something, right? The canvas then applies to the sunset. It's probably a little bit dark, so in this case, I might need to adjust the opacity down so that I get some of the canvas texture, but not too much of it. Okay? So that would be with a multiply. Okay? Let's switch instead to a screen, right? And I'll bump this back up, right? We can see that in this case, right, the grunge texture, especially where it's really light, has lightened my image to the point where this is almost like a faded print, right? It's not sharp anymore. So it's kind of the opposite of the multiply texture. And if I move down to the overlay, right, I kind of get the best of both worlds. I get some lightening of it, and I get some darkening of it, but we can really see that canvas texture behind. So this takes the photograph and makes it a little bit more a piece of art rather than a true photograph. Okay? Now I can push this far beyond the scope of reasonable, right? I can start to throw all these textures together. For example, we could apply this one, and then we could go get like a crinkled paper texture. Let's go back, maybe something like this. All right, let me go ahead and download this one as well. Copy this to my flash drive. There we go. And I could load this one. Oops. Sorry, wrong file. There we go. I can go to File and then Place, and we could drop that paper in. There it is. Again, I have to make this big enough. All right, so now I have this wrinkle that goes through it. And I'll change the blending mode here to be, say, overlay. Right? And now we can see that not only do I have the canvas, but I have the wrinkle that goes through it. Right? So you can start to see how these things can layer up rather quickly, and how you can take something that would otherwise be a photograph and really transform what it looks like. Okay? So I'm going to ask you for that to post two images. The original, so we'll go back all the way back to the original, right? And then the one with one or two textures applied to it, right, as the grunge textures. Okay?
So it doesn't have to be a texture. You could overlay any picture.
Right. So you could actually overlay two pictures. You could take, right, in terms of how this stuff works, I could go to File, Place. I could take the image of the lady that I found first, this one. All right, let's make her a little bit bigger, like that. And I could apply a multiply, or excuse me, an overlay to her, and then she would show up as part of the image. Okay? I could take away these two textures and have, oops, let me commit to this. Take away those two textures and just have her as part of the sunset. So you can see how quickly you can start to layer up things, okay, in terms of combining images together. These blending modes are extraordinarily powerful tools in terms of what you can do and what you can create. I'm going to show you one other option that's actually not written out here, but just for the sake of demonstration in terms of what you can do. And I'm going to look for something that's a little bit more of a portrait. Yeah?
When you say the blending mode, you want to save it with like all the textures or just that one texture you use?
Whatever the one is that you used. So this is for the last one with the grunge texture. I just need an original and some texture applied to it. If you want to save it with all the textures, great. If you want to save it with one texture, that's fine. I just need some proof that you did it. Remember, exercises are all about experimentation. There's no right or wrong answer. If they turn out really ugly, no worries, right? That's the nature of an exercise. Okay, so let's look here for a second for a portrait. Trying to find a good example. Okay, let's take this one. Okay, so we've got this lady sitting on the boat. Actually, that's a terrible composition. We're not going to do that one. Better composition. Okay, so we'll take this one. I'm going to go ahead and download the original size of this image. All right, there it is. Let me show it and let me copy it. Again, this isn't required as part of today, but I want to show you how you can kind of push the envelope of what these blending modes do. Let's go ahead and put this into today's folder. Paste. All right, so there it is. I'm going to open that up in Photoshop. I'm going to go to File and then Open, and I'll open that image up. Okay? So I have this image. It's not bad. It probably needs a little bit of adjustment. We could probably do a levels adjustment to it, etc. But I want to take this a step further to work with the blending modes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a duplicate of this layer. So just like we did before, I'll come down, I'll duplicate the layer, so I have a second copy. Now in this second copy, I'm ultimately going to be applying something called a soft light. Okay? But if I just jump to the soft light, it's not quite right. Okay? So instead of doing that first, I'm going to take the background copy, and I'm going to go up to Filter, and I'm going to create a Gaussian blur of this image. And this essentially allows us to blur a piece of the image. So there she is. Right? As I increase this radius, we can see that the image itself is starting to blur. If I push too far, the whole image becomes blurred. Okay? Way too much. So what I'm after is something about like that. Okay? I'll go ahead and say OK. And then I'll take this and apply the soft light blending mode to it. Okay? And it subtly enhances kind of the glow of somebody. Okay? It makes you glow a little bit more. And maybe this isn't the best example. There's probably too much green in the water. But you get the idea of you can make these subtle changes to a particular image. I'll see if I can find a better example so that you can see the contrast for something like this. But it's another strategy that's out there that you can definitely use. Okay? So I know it's a lot to take in, and there's lots of individual steps and lots of experimentation necessary. You can probably breeze through this and finish it rather quickly. Okay? I'd rather have you take your time and really think about what's happening and experiment, try different photos. Right? Don't just, oh, screen, multiply, overlay, save, I'm done. Right? If you spend a little bit of time and you really work with it, you can start to see the power of what you're doing. Right? Remember, these things apply to your assignment should you want them to. You have an assignment that is due on Wednesday before the start of class. Okay? There's two pieces to turning in this assignment. Number one, you have to post it to the course website before class starts, before I start talking. Okay? And you have to hand me a printed copy. You can print it just on the school printer. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Right? No fancy paper. I used to make people go to a print shop and have it printed, but nobody does that anymore anyway, so it's kind of a pointless thing. So all you have to do is print it on the school printer. It gives me a paper copy of what you turned in just as a record, just in case something happens or whatever. Okay? So I asked for that. I'm not so worried that you hand that to me prior to the start of class. I just want it tomorrow, or I want it on Wednesday. Does that make sense? But the post absolutely has to be before the start of class. If it's not before the start of class, you will be subject to the late policy. Okay? So this is your best photo. It probably involves some post-processing of some kind. Right? How much post-processing is up to you. You do not have to do every single step that I've taught you in the last 2 lectures, but recognize that all of those steps are available to you should your image need that kind of post-processing. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay. The other part of turning it in, you should read the handout to make sure, but I ask you to post the original image and the post-processed image, and I ask you to write a little paragraph about what post-processing you did. Okay, so what steps you did. Did you adjust levels? Did you adjust curves? Did you apply a blending mode? Those kinds of things. Okay? Are there any further questions about that? Yeah.
For today's exercise, it says there should be 10 images. That's just if we use a different image each time.
Correct. So if you did a different image each time, you'd be at 10. If you didn't do a different image each time, you'd be less than that. I think it's maybe 6. You wouldn't have the originals because there'd only be one original. I'm not going to go through, like I said before, and count, oh, you have 10 images. What I'm looking for is a screen, a multiply, an overlay, a luminosity, and a grunge texture. Those are the critical ones. And it's nice when you have the original and the adjusted one so that you can see what you did to change it. That's why I like the original. Okay? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. I'll turn you loose.